Hello and welcome to this video on the Marxist perspective of society. Marxism is similar to functionalism in so much that it views society as a structure that shapes individuals' behaviour and ideas. So it's a macro approach once again. However, it is different to functionalism in many ways. Firstly, it sees the social structure as built on a conflict of interest. So whereas functionalism was a consensus perspective, this is very much a conflict perspective. Marxism also sees society as unstable, capable of sudden or revolutionary change. And this means that the structure is merely the product of the ruling class being able to impose their will. So unlike functionalism that sees society as broadly very stable and under control and harmonious and very much sees it in that positive light, Marxists have some real concerns with the structure of society and say that actually it's unstable and it's likely to change. Within Marxism, however, there are differences of opinion over how social change can occur. So Marxism is kind of an umbrella term, as we'll come to see, and there are a range of different Marxisms that we will want to learn about. So in terms of background, Marxism is based on the ideas of Karl Marx. And Karl Marx was a German philosopher, thinker, writer, economist, political scientist, and of course, sociologist, although he may not have referred to himself as such. He saw the harm caused by modern industrial society, and of course he's writing in the 1800s, which is really the crucible of modernity and modern industrial society, whilst also seeing the potential that it had for creating a better society. So he was looking at the Industrial Revolution, he was looking at people working and toiling and improving the world around them, but it came at great cost for a particular group that he was very fond of, namely the workers. He believed it possible to understand society scientifically like Durkheim and described his ideas as scientific socialism. So he believed he was creating a science of society, and in a sense that's very similar to what Durkheim was seeking to do when he was studying society, and he referred to his ideas as scientific socialism, but today we generally sort of refer to his ideas as Marxism, so he's given his name to the theory, if you will. He did not see progress as gradual and evolutionary in the way that Durkheim did. Rather, he saw it as sudden and revolutionary, and he was particularly interested in this idea of revolution. Marx believed capitalism would increase human misery before giving way to classless communism. So the economic model that in many ways forged the Industrial Revolution was capitalism, and we still live in capitalism today. But he saw how capitalism could create and indeed increase human misery, and he was concerned about this and believed that we needed to kind of get rid of this, that we needed to overthrow it and create a class of society based on communism. Marx was not just a theorist, he was a revolutionary socialist. He wanted to change the world. He wanted to change humanity, change human society. He famously said that up until the time of his birth, philosophers had only interpreted the world, and he believed now was the time to try and change the world. After his death, Marxism became the basis of communism. So today, when we sort of talk about communism, and you may have heard it referred to in your politics or your history lessons, Marxism and communism are often seen as being synonymous or one and the same. And his ideology was the official ideology of the Soviet Union, which was the group of states headed by Russia following the revolution in the early 20th century, which sought to create a socialist or communist society. However, it's worth saying that many would disagree with the idea that true communism had been implemented in the Soviet Union. Many feel that actually it was state capitalism, but that's for a different debate and discussion. In terms of historical materialism, materialism is the view that human beings have material needs, so we need certain things to survive, and must work to meet those needs using the means of production. In complex societies, people work together to meet each other's needs, and these are the relations of production. So the means of production are the things you need to make the stuff to survive. So that might mean, a factory and the machines and the computers, also the land and the raw goods. Those are all part of the means of production. The relations of production are the way in which the people who work using the means of production, the way in which they're related to each other. As societies grow and develop, social classes form, Marx argued, and you tend to find that within capitalism you have two classes, a labouring class, those doing the work, and a class that owns the means of production. If we put the means of production together with the relations of production, this equals the mode of production. And for Marx at the time that he was alive, and for us as well, this is capitalism. The mode of production forms what is known as the economic base of society. So Marx here is trying to put together a model to help us understand how capitalist society works. The base shapes the rest of society, which Marx referred to as the superstructure. So for example, things like the law, things like religion, the media, the government, etc., they are all a reflection of what is happening in the economic base. So if you have a capitalist economic base for society, you're going to find that all of the institutions in society reflect that capitalist economic base in some way, or they are shaped and moulded by it. And here's a nice simple diagram to help us understand it. It's quite a famous diagram. You will see it in other textbooks, and if you go to university and you study a social science, you're going to learn probably about this in even more detail. So you can see at the bottom there you've got the economic base, which houses the relations of production and the means of production, and together that of course forms the mode of production, and that shapes the superstructure. So things like education, family, religion, politics and mass media, they maintain and legitimize the base. They make the base appear normal, acceptable, and so on. Now then, Marx was interested in class society and how these different social classes have come to be, and how class society ultimately leads to exploitation. And he did a bit of history. He kind of looked into the past and looked at different stages of human society or human history and saw how there had been different types of social classes. He believed that if we go way, way back to early man, so we're thinking about when Homo sapiens first really started standing on two legs and started forming early human society, we lived in a primitive communism where everyone shared everything. You know, it was difficult to make things, difficult to make tools, difficult to make clothes. It was difficult to make sure that everyone had enough food and shelter and warmth. And so we all had to work together. We formed a very basic social contract in order to do that. At the same time, there was no concept of monogamy. There was no concept of one man on one woman, and there was no concept of marriage, no concept of, being, having a single relationship with a single person. Instead, we lived in a promiscuous horde. Everyone was having sex with each other to have as many children as possible to survive, to ensure that the species would continue. As the forces of production changed, however, so social classes were formed in these very early societies, and this is a theme that carries on in subsequent societies. So actually man started to become more sophisticated at making tools and clothes and hunting food and providing shelter and so on. And as we began to be able to produce more and more, no longer do we have to live in this primitive communism. And so class society started to form, and actually the next stage was known as slavery, where we had the powerful enslave the weak, and humans could literally be property, and the powerful would hoard all of the goods and services they needed, and you either had to be a slave and hope that there would be some sort of trickle down and you'd be able to survive that way, or you were a free man and basically you were doing it on your own, and that was very difficult. In class societies, the class that owns the means of production also controls society's surplus product, that which is extra to need. So if you are part of the social class that owns the means of production, of course you're going to be producing goods, or your workers are going to be producing goods. That's the social class beneath you. And of those goods, you're then going to sell them, and you're probably going to make a profit, and there'll probably be extra products left over, which means you can have even more profit, and you get to keep that. You get to keep that surplus product. And so again, just to reiterate, we've moved through several different stages of human history. So we started off in that primitive communism with its promiscuous horde. Then this gives way to ancient society, or slavery, where we have a powerful class who enslave the weak. And that powerful class begins to want to make sure that, when they have children, that it's going to be their children. And so they create the concept of marriage. And we looked at this before in your first year, and so that way they're able to ensure that their children are their children and they can pass their property on to them. This ultimately gives way to feudal society, where we had landowners, or we had lords of the manor. We also had kings, queens, earls, dukes, emperors, and serfs. These were the people who worked the land. And if you've ever watched any sort of medieval program or even Game of Thrones, you get a feel for what feudal society was all about. Ultimately, this gives way to capitalist society, where the serfs leave the land and they move to work in cities and they become workers. They become what Marx is about to refer to as the proletariat, and the empowered class become those who own the means of production in the cities, owning the factories and the machines, referred to as the bourgeoisie. So, capitalism, in a bit more detail, has three main features. Firstly, the proletariat, unlike slaves and serfs, are legally free from the means of production, but they have to labour to survive. So if you are a worker, if you're born into the proletariat as a social class, you do not own the means of production, you do not own property, therefore you have to work to survive. But you are technically free. You are not owned in the same sense that slaves were. You are not bound to the land in the same way that serfs were. The proletariat, however, are not paid fairly. They are not paid the worth of what they produce, but instead are paid what is known as subsistence. So they are paid just enough in order to survive, but not really enough in order to, really enjoy a exciting standard of living, if you will. So they're not paid fairly. They are exploited. This creates surplus value, because if we take the sale price of a product that a worker has worked on and we take away from it the cost of production and the wages that the worker has been paid, what you've got left over is profit. And in terms of who gets to keep the profit, it is the bourgeoisie. Now, to be fair, some of that profit is probably going to be reinvested into the business and allows the business to grow. But as the business grows and more profit is made, then ultimately it's the bourgeoisie who enjoy that profit. Secondly, through competition between capitalists, so between members of the bourgeoisie, the property owners, the owners of the means of production, ownership of property becomes concentrated in fewer and fewer hands. So if we had two businesses competing, as these different businesses competed, one might well win, might well, outdo the other, and that second business might collapse, and that first business might buy up the second business. And so what's happened is properties actually become concentrated in the owner of that first company. So it's owned by fewer and fewer people, it's in fewer and fewer hands. So small businesses become proletarianized, they ultimately become poor, they become weak, they often go out of business. The proletariat is impoverished through ever lower wages, so ultimately the bourgeoisie want to make sure they're making even more profit, and so if opportunities come about whereby they can pay their workers less, they will do so. Our third feature is the forces of production continually expand. So you have technological advancements which de-skill the workforce. So for example, with the introduction of computers and different machines and robots, we are finding increasingly that certain jobs no longer exist. They're not necessary, and so workers get laid off, they lose their jobs, and the workforce becomes de-skilled because it becomes less necessary to train workers when you can have a robot doing something, and maybe you might have one worker pressing a button, but that's about it. The social classes therefore become yet more polarized, and so that gap between the super rich bourgeoisie and the impoverished proletariat is becoming greater and greater, or so Marx argued. Society therefore becomes increasingly divided along class lines. So, what's going to happen? Well, Marx argued that ultimately the workers are going to form class consciousness. He said that capitalism sows the seeds of its own destruction, that actually capitalism is its own gravedigger, to quote Marx. By bringing ever more proletarians together, or proletarian workers together, this creates the conditions for the formation of class consciousness. Marx believed that if you had enough workers together working on a factory line or unemployed, that they would start to look at each other and say, well, hold on a minute, there are thousands of us, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of us, not only in this country but across the world. Why are we suffering? Why are we being paid less? Why are we working so hard for so little payoff? Why are we unemployed? Why are we being de-skilled? And that by talking to each other and understanding their exploitation, they could begin to form class consciousness and awareness of their exploitation. By doing this, they could move beyond simply being a class in itself, so a class that simply exists, to becoming a class for itself, a class that's going to try and do things, to change things for itself, for its own interests. And it can become aware of the need to overthrow capitalism. Marx believed that the workers would start to see that actually capitalism is the thing that's causing it to be so unhappy, causing all this exploitation and this impoverishment, and that it's capitalism that needs to be overthrown, needs to be destroyed. In terms of ideology, the class that owns the means of production also controls mental production, and that is the production of ideas. And so this is where we find a problem, if you will, for the proletariat. This is what's going to hinder or prevent class consciousness from being formed. The dominant ideas of any particular age are those of the dominant class. So in capitalism, capitalists have power, they have bourgeois power, and they control the production of ideas. If we look at the media, if we look at religion, if we look at other institutions in our society like education, those who control those institutions tend to be members of the bourgeoisie, and they make sure that the ideas that are disseminated or spread around through those institutions are ideas which empower them and prevent the workers from realizing their exploitation, prevent the workers from realizing that capitalism is the problem. This ideology creates what we might refer to as a false consciousness, and it's kind of nicely shown in that picture in the top right hand corner, where you've got kind of a member of the bourgeoisie sitting in a hammock on a hot sunny day enjoying a lemonade, and you've got members of the proletariat on the right there who are kind of holding him up, who are probably working for him, supplying him with the profit he needs to enjoy that kind of lifestyle. And this member of the bourgeoisie is saying, know what those damn Marxists want to do? Take away our tree. Sort of saying, if we're not careful, those Marxists, those socialists, those people who want to do away with capitalism are going to have to make you work even harder to hold me up. And so it's a way of trying to fool those workers there from realizing, actually, why are we holding this person up at all? So it creates a false consciousness. This can be combated, Marx argued, by class consciousness. That once again, the workers need to be talking to each other, need to be realizing their exploitation, need to be coming up with ideas about how they're going to overthrow capitalism. Marx believed that our true nature, that humans' true nature, is based on our capacity to create things to meet our needs. He believed that actually people like working, people like being creative, people like being active, and that's part of who we are. But when we lose control over our labour and the things we produce, we become alienated, we become disconnected from the world around us, we become sad, upset, depressed, despondent. We become, again, sort of disconnected from the world around us and our fellow workers, and we are alienated because as workers, or for the vast majority of us who probably would form the proletariat, we are not getting to reap the rewards of the things we create for the bourgeoisie. Alienation exists in all class societies, but is particularly strong or prevalent within capitalism because workers do not control the means of production. The division of labour is intense. The worker is reduced to mindlessly repeating the same task. And if you think back to the first year, I showed you, or you will have watched a video, hopefully, of the Ford car production plant, where you saw workers doing the same task over and over again, repeated for hours and hours and hours. Now, the problem there is that is quite a mindless activity. It's quite mind-numbing, and it is depressing. We found that people who worked in those kind of industries, or people who work in those kind of industries, have very low job satisfaction. Marx defined the state as armed bodies of men. He looked at the state as it stands today within a capitalist society, and by the state we mean the government and all of its institutions. He saw the state as being bourgeois in nature, being controlled by the bourgeoisie, and defended by armed bodies of men, namely the police and, of course, the army. The state exists to defend those who control it, namely the bourgeoisie. Any class that wishes to lead a revolution must overthrow the ruling class. So if you want to change capitalism, want to get rid of it, you're going to have to overthrow the ruling class, because at this point in time, the ruling class quite like capitalism because it's good for them. So you need to get rid of them if you are to get rid of capitalism. The proletariat revolution, or the proletarian revolution, will be the first by a majority class against a minority, Marx believed, and it will abolish the state and create classless communism. So Marx ultimately believed that you needed to get rid of the state entirely, you needed to get rid of social classes, you needed to abolish the bourgeoisie and create a classless society. So everyone would be part of the proletariat, and because by very nature of being part of the same class, you would not actually have a proletariat. We would cease to exist. We would all be workers. We would replace private ownership of property with social ownership, hence communism. Everyone would share in the equal endeavours of those around them. You would take what you need, you give back what you could. This would hopefully end alienation, and we would feel far more fulfilled as individuals as a result. Marx believed that the revolution was imminent and would begin in advanced capitalist economies. Marx lived much of his life in London, actually, and there's a number of landmarks in London that you can visit to see where he lived and worked and so on. And he believed that if the revolution was going to happen, it was probably most likely to happen in either London or Manchester, because these were places where large members of proletarians were living and working together and were realizing increasingly their exploitation. Now then, Marx had some fantastic ideas, but there are, of course, some clear criticisms. Firstly, in terms of social class, it's kind of a one-dimensional view of inequality. Marx only really considers sort of class inequalities and social class inequalities between the workers and the business owners or the property owners. The two-class model arguably is oversimplistic. Even within the proletariat, within the workers, or within the working class, as we might refer to them today, you get many different levels. Everything from those who are, barely employed or infrequently employed to those who are highly skilled and, working their way up into the middle classes. Class polarization also has not perhaps occurred in the same way that he believed it would, although there are still social classes, and I do think they're fairly kind of prevalent within the United Kingdom. Perhaps that class polarization hasn't occurred to the extent that he would believe, or perhaps it's still to come. There's a big debate still to be had there. Also, the industrial proletariat has shrunk. We don't really have large amounts of workers, say, in the UK or in the US or most of Europe, working in factories or in sort of those heavy industries. Increasingly, most people work in the service industry. And the middle class has actually grown. In fact, the middle class now is the majority class. It's taken over the working classes, if you will, although many Marxists today would still contest that point. To go back very briefly to this idea of the one-dimensional view of inequality, there's no mention by Marx of gender inequalities. There's no mention by Marx of inequalities with regards to ethnicity or any other inequality for that matter. He really only focuses on social class. In terms of economic determinism with regards to criticisms, the base superstructure model assumes that economic factors are the cause of everything in society. He therefore ignores free will. He ignores the idea that human beings, we have free will, we do come up with our own ideas, we are conscious. Sometimes we do things that go against reason or rationality. Sometimes things happen randomly, and Marx doesn't really think about that because he takes this kind of scientific socialist approach. He sees everything as being cause and effect, and he kind of falls into that positivist trap. He neglects the role of ideas in changing society, so there is actually no place in his base superstructure model for ideas, and he sees ideology as purely something that's being produced in the superstructure as a product of the relations in the economic base. Other Marxists have come along afterwards, in particular people like Gramsci, people like Althusser, and have had different ideas about where Marx should have put ideas within that model. The revolution has not occurred worldwide. Now, this is the biggest area of debate and discussion because, of course, there was an attempt, and there have been many other attempts actually than the one I'm simply thinking of. There was an attempt in 1917 to create a communist society by Vladimir Lenin and his contemporaries in Russia, and they sought to form the USSR and to create a global proletarian society, a global communist society, which ultimately failed with the collapse of the USSR at the end of the 1980s and beginning of the 1990s. There's been other attempts as well in places like China, places like North Korea, places like Venezuela, places like Cuba, and those have succeeded or failed to varying extents depending on how deep you want to go into the discussion. Now, many Marxists would argue that actually the revolution is still to come, that perhaps we haven't quite got there yet. Others might still argue, and especially if you take a kind of more democratic socialist or a social democrat view that really the future is going to be a hybrid between socialism and capitalism. And to an extent, that's kind of what we see in the UK and in other European nations. It is an area of debate. This is an essentially contested topic. Now then, we're going to do some more work on two different types of Marxisms, or the two sort of dominant types of Marxism, namely the humanistic and the scientific. But this will be covered in lesson. That said, you have been given some reading on this, so please make sure you do that reading prior to the lesson and write down any questions you might have. Some of it's quite complex, so get those questions down and we can discuss those in the lesson and come to some conclusions.